Welcome and thank you for joining us. My name is Karen Corman and I have the privilege of being the Executive Director of the UIC Alumni Association. Welcome to the UIC Alumni Exchange Series. We are hosting weekly events that bring you news, knowledge, and entertainment to help you explore, connect, and even escape from the everyday with a community of UIC alumni, staff, and faculty experts. You'll hear me say this just a few times today, but I encourage you to visit go.uic.edu/alumni exchange for the latest and greatest programming. And with that, I'm excited to start our program this afternoon by welcoming alumna Michelle Kaysen, who will lead us in a discussion and share her experiences from 17 years of regulating industries to clean up residential and public lands that they are responsible for polluting. Thank you, Michelle, for being with us this afternoon. And I'd like to turn it over to you to begin the discussion.
Hi, thanks, Karen. Again, my name is Michelle Kaysen, and I'm with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. I'm an environmental scientist in the RCRA Corrective Action Program, and I've been with the agency for 17 years. So as you can see, the U.S. EPA is divided into 10 regions across the nation, and each state also has its own environmental agency that we partner with. So I'm out of Region 5 in Chicago, and that region includes the 6 states shown here on the map. And what this means is that I could have a cleanup in any one of those states. So today I'm going to provide a broad overview of my work and the program. I want to hit a little bit on the law, the policy, and the science. And I hope not to drill down too far into anything specific to put you to sleep. So with that in mind, I want to do this from the perspective that I find a lot of people are surprised about EPA and their role. I think it's pretty safe to say that for most of us, our homes are our greatest investments, and we certainly don't think of them being vulnerable to other people's contamination. But unfortunately, that does happen. And that's the perspective I'm going to share here today in a couple of case studies. What happens when our communities and our homes are impacted by contamination and how EPA in general handles that. So with that in mind, imagine walking down into your basement and seeing a sustained flame on a crack in the foundation of your basement, or gazing out your front window for days or maybe even weeks at a drill rig like this, or better yet, watching a behemoth like this roll through your backyard. I'd like to just pull up a real quick poll to get a sense for what you all think EPA mostly does. What comes to mind when you think about US EPA? So we've got a lot of Clean Water Act, and the Clean Air Act is gaining some traction there. So that's interesting. So far, almost 70% of you think mostly of the Clean Air Act. Yeah, okay, so that's sort of consistent with my impression of what people think about when EPA comes to mind. And you can see right here, I think because they're in the news probably the most, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and EPA's role in the national policy. I would say the second most common thing folks think about are these large national incidents that occur, but they don't happen that often. The one thing that sort of remains out of view, I find, is that our cleanup programs quite often have to deal with the realities of contamination migrating from the source, which is usually an industrial source, to somebody else's property. And when that somebody else's property is residential, it really adds to the complexity of our work. So I'm going to walk through a couple of case studies right after I sort of give you a broad overview. So my work always starts at hazardous waste facilities, and those facilities can range from a steel mill to a power plant to just a small plant that produces any kind of widget you can think of. There's a lot of chemicals involved in the industrial sector, and a lot of them are considered hazardous waste, and so that's where my role comes in. So a little bit about the law, how it is I do what I do. My program is under the 1976 Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, or RCRA law. This law came into effect to manage hazardous waste, and it does so really from cradle to grave and anything in between. So it regulates the generation and the disposal and all activities in between. And in 1984, that law was expanded to include my program, with a huge incentive in doing so to reduce the number of future Superfund sites. Superfund is our other cleanup program, and it deals with abandoned sites. And typically these sites are abandoned, both physically as well as financially. So there is no viable responsible party. And so Superfund sites tend to use, they don't always, but they tend to use taxpayer dollars so that EPA can address those sites. Whereas the RCRA law in '84 was amended to try to minimize that. It shifts the burden of these cleanup sites away from the taxpayer and onto the responsible party. So I regulate and oversee a responsible party who conducts the investigation and the cleanup per approvals and the legal obligation that they have with EPA through an order. So part of that law allows us, it gives us the authority to compel a responsible party to go beyond their property boundary and chase that contamination, to delineate it to its greatest extent. So that is how we end up in some pretty interesting scenarios when contamination has migrated off of those sites of origination. So here is one of my sites. There is an entire 1/2 of a town contaminated. This is one of the largest sites of its kind. You can see on the right-hand side of the photo, there's lots of industry. This town is adjacent to multiple oil refineries, and over the course of 4 to 5 decades, those refineries and their associated infrastructure, which includes pipes that run from the refinery under the village, released gasoline into the ground. And so half of the village now sits on top of gasoline that is in the groundwater and smeared within the soil below their homes. So about 200 residential homes and a couple of small businesses were included in this investigation, and quite a few of them required mitigation measures to deal with the imminent risk, which we'll cover now. So gasoline is, it's a volatile chemical. It evaporates easily, and it causes the stinky fumes that we associate with gasoline. And when it is underground, it does the same thing. So the liquid gasoline that's about 30 feet below these homes, it off-gasses. It produces vapors that then move up through the soil. And when vapors can get close enough to a structure, they can come into that structure, and that's called vapor intrusion. It's the same process as when a home is impacted by radon. Structures are not impervious, and they are vulnerable to gases coming in. And so when those gases in the context of our cleanups are ignitable, that certainly poses a unique combination of challenges. So you have the inhalation human health risk to the people inside the home, but you also have this explosion risk associated with the ignitable vapor. So the picture on the left is an actual basement from this village. I spend a lot of time with the homeowners. None of this happens quickly, and so we develop relationships. I'm in their village for years, and a lot of them have told me, yeah, when I was little, we knew it happened. We didn't know why it happened, and Dad would just tell me to go down to the basement and put the fire out. So this is a pretty extreme case, but it is nonetheless something that does happen. So the complexity of this kind of site is there's a high degree of complexity, and the initial phases of this kind of a site is super intense. So you are challenged to get into every single structure that you can. That requires access agreements with the property owner, and you need to quantify the risk within every structure, which is often different from home to home, building to building. So simultaneously to doing that and trying to provide these homeowners with the time that they deserve to sit down with a government entity and to talk about what's happening, you have to get that on-site, site-wide investigation started right away. It's really important to get in there to figure out what is going on so that you can do something about it, as quick as possible. So at this site, while we're in the homes and figuring that component out, there are thousands of samples being collected across the village. You can see in this figure just a tiny representation of some of the sample locations. And at sites like this, when the data is overwhelming, it's overwhelming for any human brain. We rely a lot on visualization tools. And you can see a screenshot from our 3-dimensional model where we plug in all of our field data into this model, and it helps us to figure out where is the contamination, how much of it is there, and how is it interacting with the geologic formation at any given point. So these tools are invaluable. So every investigation unfolds differently. They all have basically the same steps. When I am involved in developing an investigation plan with a responsible party, I really like to combine qualitative and quantitative field tools that can rapidly build out collaborative data sets. It's so important to move these types of sites along very quickly, and investing in a really savvy investigation up front can lessen the amount of time in the field and get you to a remedial strategy much quicker. So on the left here, you can see an operator standing at one of these fancy tools. This is called an LIF, or a laser-induced fluorescence. And what this tool does is it drives a probe down into the ground. And in a moment, I'll play a 30-second video so you can see how that works and hear how that works. And you might want to turn the volume down just a little bit because it's a little bit loud. So as this probe is pushed down into the ground, there is a fiber optics cable that runs through it, and it generates a laser light that shines out a window on the probe as it's being moved through the soil. And that light excites the molecules within petroleum products that fluoresce. And you can see exactly what this tool does on the bottom middle picture. The top half shows you what contamination looks like in the visible light. Okay, I guess it's there, whatever. But the bottom half is what is really the benefit of this tool. It lights up the contamination. You can see where it is, and you can get a qualitative feel for how much it is. And that helps us then take very focused samples or actions in the investigation moving forward. So I'm going to play this little video, and the first thing you will see is this operator standing at the probe that's going down into the ground. Then you will see an operator feeding the fiber optic cable in, and then last it'll pan over to some of the field crew that's watching this data come in real time on the computer that's mounted to the truck. So there it is, and you can imagine being a resident with that obnoxious piece of equipment on your street or in your neighborhood for days or even weeks. It's tough. It's hard for folks. But this is one data set or line of evidence that we used in this village that really helped shape the investigation. A couple of others that we use, because there's a ton of data, like I said, on this site, are in the center of the slide, the purple and the blue. So the purple represents where we would stick a probe into the ground and collect the soil gas samples. The air that exists underground in between the soil particles is called soil gas. And the purple represents where the gasoline vapors are. We pair that with the oxygen data that came from under the ground in the blue. And if you sort of cross your eyes and imagine those two superimposed, you can see that they sort of form a puzzle. And they do that because the petroleum vapors, the gasoline vapors, will displace oxygen vapors. And these collaborative data sets, sort of bringing it all into greater and greater focus and finer resolution, tells us not only where the gasoline vapors are, but where they are at high enough concentrations to displace that naturally occurring oxygen. So, the point of all these cool tools and visualization aids is to get to a remediation strategy that is effective and focused. And, the last figure on here shows us what we ultimately built to protect these homeowners, which is a soil vapor extraction system. It's essentially a giant vacuum that is underground beneath this entire village. Wells that are strategically placed and lines that they connect to, they're all sucked up and sent off to a treatment center. So I will actually just take a moment here to pause and to let you guys ask any questions that you may have.
That's perfect. We just had one come through.
Right.
How fast do the petroleum derivatives travel through the soil?
So it's highly variable. And the interesting thing about petroleum products is that, I'm going to try to make this succinct, which I sometimes struggle at. They are largely carbon. And the critters and the bugs, the little tiny bacteria that are underground, they're so weird. They eat petroleum products. So depending upon your geology, your contamination strength, and the bacterial colonies that exists below ground, highly regulates that particular piece of information. And so, depending on how deep your petroleum product is, that liquid that at this village is 30 feet below ground, vapors can travel within hours or days. And it largely depends on what's going on in that little micro environment as it pertains to the microbial populations, like I said, and how quickly they're able to metabolize those contaminants. Gasoline spills often don't ever produce vapor intrusion because of this biological activity. It is not uncommon that they will actually eat up the gaseous phase fast enough to prevent vapor intrusion. But here the source is multi-million gallons of gasoline. That's not enough.
Interesting. I don't know if you can answer this question, but it was asked by several people about when you were showing the picture of the town, people were asking where the town is. I'm not sure if you're able to disclose that or not.
Well, I would rather not. Everything that I'm using in this presentation is public record, but I feel kind of strongly about not doing that to these communities when I present.
Of course, but wanted to ask.
Yeah.
There was a question that came when earlier on when you were presenting, which was what was the original motivation for establishing the EPA?
That's a great question, and I want to know the answer to that. Nixon established the EPA, and maybe it coincided with, no, I think Love Canal came after that. That's a great question, but I don't know the answer. I don't know why Nixon felt compelled or felt the need or felt the pressure to create the EPA.
Would have been an interesting question to say who was president when the EPA was created. And
that I could answer.
That's that's all for right now. But thank you for pausing so we could ask a few.
Yeah, absolutely. So, all these investigation tools are, they're interesting, they're critical for the investigation, but it really brings us back full circle to the impacted homeowners. And to me, that's what these types of sites are all about. In these situations, there's a lot of work that actually needs to be done inside the homes. You cannot gather a complete picture of what's happening with a multi-million gallon spill without getting resolution of the subsurface below those homes. So you can see on the left, we're drilling a hole in a basement. And we had to do this in a lot of these homes, most of these homes. So we're in the home, we're drilling in their basement, we're putting in a probe so that we can continue to measure the soil gas below the home. It's really intrusive. And this is really hard on homeowners. And this site will go on for years, and they've already endured years. So it's an enormous balancing act to gather the data that you need to complete the picture, to build a remedy, to protect these homeowners. I don't want to say regularly, it used to be more regular than it is now because of that vacuum system, but we evacuate homes in this community. Based on the monitoring data that we can collect from under their home and from within their home, we can determine whether or not it's safe for them to be there. And I will usually have like a day or so heads up based on trends, and I will, here's a clue, I will drive down to that site and try to be with that homeowner when we ask them to leave their home for a period of time. We put them up into the responsible party puts them up into a hotel, and we get into that home and we work to make all the systems optimized or to fix any issues that are in the home that's creating that preferential pathway. Here in this case, I actually created a community focus group. It's a regular set of folks from the village, from the municipality, teachers and pastors, and we meet quarterly, we email regularly. It's a way to provide maximum transparency and to really provide meaningful engagement. And that is really what these types of sites are all about, is that meaningful engagement for the impacted homeowners. So, like I said, that site is really an extreme. This next site is a little less extreme. We're not in their homes, but truly, whenever you're on somebody's private property, their home property, it presents a lot of challenges. So at this site, we had over 30 backyards that were contaminated with PCBs. PCBs are polychlorinated biphenyls. They are man-made chemicals that are damn near indestructible. They last a very long time in the environment. They bioaccumulate up the food chain, and they are probable human carcinogens. So here we had a site that's upstream. It is off the view of this neighborhood. They had a historic release of PCBs, and during the investigation way up there, we kept expanding the investigation to find out, where does this stuff end? And we found ourselves a mile downstream at this neighborhood. The PCBs got into the water and migrated downstream. They got into the sediments at the bottom of the creek. And through many years of floods and receding, activities over and over again, the PCBs got buried in these backyards. So we had contamination, fairly close to the surface, as well as pretty deep, because this had been going on for quite a while. So in this scenario, these homes were really, really beautiful, and the backyards were stunning. They backed up to this creek. They were long, huge backyards with these mature trees, huge canopy. And for this entire half-a-mile stretch, they were lucky enough to have properties in this riparian ecosystem, this area of terrestrial and aquatic habitat where this creek empties into a larger river. And it's beautiful. And these homeowners don't live across the street from 3 oil refineries. So they were stunned when they learned that their backyards were contaminated. And they were really, really mad. They were super mad. So when I had my first public meeting, it brought out about 100 community members, and they all stood for 3 hours and screamed at me for 3 hours straight. So it was pretty rough, but I was new to EPA, and this was my first residential cleanup. So I had the luxury of this office view. Well, I'm going to have the responsible party dig up all the backyards, take out all that soil, and they're just going to have to replace it with clean soil. And that was not at all what these homeowners wanted. They were savvy, and they realized what that would mean. That would mean trees coming down. That would mean the topography of their property would change, and it would ruin this entire habitat. So, the really hard lesson out of the gate that I learned on this site was to never assume what the community wants, or necessarily what's best for them, until you've done consistent engagement that is meaningful, and you understand their perspective, and you really respect their perspective. Because when residential homes are involved, emotions run really, really high. And what I learned was that these homeowners didn't want to lose 100-year-old trees, and they didn't want to lose the unique property, the unique qualities of their individual properties, and communally, they didn't want to lose this habitat, which, upon doing my homework, I realized was a really critical habitat for the entire county as well as the area. So, this learning experience, sent me back to the drawing board, basically. And I had to find a way to implement this cleanup while following the PCB regulations, eliminating the unacceptable risk to these properties, and preserving the integrity of this amazing habitat, as well as the homeowners' individual desires for their properties. And so I did what everybody does. I found people far smarter than I am, and I consulted with a lot of PCB experts and toxicologists, and I sat down with all of the homeowners, and we developed this risk-based strategy to the cleanup, where we gridded every property. We developed a sampling and analysis plan that allowed us to sample, I think it was like just under 4,000 soil samples, so that we could really gain a representative picture of each grid and each property. And we could talk through, okay, if we remove these grids, here's what it means for your property. You know, if we stay away from this tree, here are the pros and cons. And so this was really an amazing process that I really enjoyed doing. So Karen, are there any questions you'd like to stop for?
Yeah, thank you. So you have said these words a few times, and so I think the answer probably varies, but certainly you are the expert and would know. You've said responsible party as you've been talking about how this is covered, and so one of the questions was who pays for the destruction and repair of these homes, and my assumption is that it varies.
So the question is who pays, you said?
Who pays? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so this is the beauty of the RCRA law, the double-edged sword. So again, RCRA shifts the burden from the taxpayer to the responsible party. The responsible party is the person, the company that contaminated the property. And again, my facilities can be a steel mill, it can be a coal-fired power plant, it can be a small widget factory, you know, somewhere in the middle of the Midwest. It just depends on their has waste history. So they pay for it. And the project manager's role in this program is to oversee it. We have a legal mechanism that binds the responsible party or the company with EPA. They are obligated to, you know, follow law, policy, and guidance. And I oversee the entire process, and I either approve or disapprove of certain elements. And there are sites where responsible parties can be challenging to work with, and there's many years of fighting, and sometimes it's just down gritty in the technical level, and sometimes it is elevated and it becomes a legal fight. So they pay.
Interesting. Another question that came in: is the homeowner permission all that is needed to get these machines inside homes, or does the EPA need a permit to just be in the neighborhood?
So the responsible party is responsible for securing all necessary permits to do their work, federal and state permits. They need to gain access, property access, and typically an average site will get 50 to 70% access to properties that we would like to gain access to. So it's not a given. EPA cannot force a property owner to you know, relinquish access to that responsible party. But when, you know, when there is risk to the residents, we do try quite hard. But the EPA does not have permits associated with those activities. Again, that burden is always shifted to the responsible party within the context of this program.
Interesting. Those are the only two questions I saw so far.
Okay. So back to our PCB contaminated backyards. By being able to shift to this risk-based approach and these grids, we were able to really scale up and scale down the operation, depending on what the specific property needs were. And we could bring in much smaller equipment. We even tried some equipment that was like an air compressor around the sensitive tree roots and then vacuumed up the displaced soil. So, you know, speaking of responsible parties, I think everybody involved in this site was really lucky that the responsible party here was very responsive. They wanted to address the homeowners' concerns, and they collaborated with the agency very well. and that doesn't always happen. But when it does, as it did here, we were able to develop that plan and collect the samples within a year, and then button up all of the cleanup within 2 construction seasons, which is pretty significant. But at a site like this, I may not be in the home, but you know, these homeowners were really, really engaged in the process. And so I was in this town 1 to 3 days every month for over a year. And so, you know, each site you have to obviously customize your community engagement, and some of them definitely require a lot of time and energy invested into them. So this is my last slide. The EPA's mission is to protect human health and the environment. And when contamination gets onto residential properties, that really can pose some big challenges, both for the agency and the responsible parties. But I think if I have learned anything from 17 years on the job, it is this. No matter how angry a community is, and no matter how much they want to scream at somebody from the government, which is totally fine, that if we as civil servants show up and we stay and we keep coming back and we keep engaging folks in these conversations, the noise level comes down, you know, the pitch comes down, the emotions become, you know, more manageable, because they understand I am upset as well. And I would say that almost everybody comes around, and every time that happens for an individual homeowner or an entire community, it is worth it every time. It's really, it will be one of my life's greatest privileges to have been a civil servant and to do this type of work in that capacity when companies are unable or unwilling to do the work themselves. So I am grateful for the skills that I acquired at UIC, and I am looking forward to my 20-year milestone with the EPA.
Wonderful. Thank you, Michelle. This has been super informative and very interesting, frankly, too. Have a couple questions that are coming in, so in no particular order. I'm going to take the liberty of editing this just a little bit because it's a politically based question and we don't like to talk politics, you know, among friends. But can you talk about how your work might get affected by presidential administrations, just in a very general sense, as they switch?
Sure, absolutely. The most obvious is our budget, and my program has most certainly been impacted. We have seen impacts through the years. You know, I've worked under several administrations, and each administration often has its own set of priorities, and that can influence the sort of the tone and tenor within the agency, you know, what is going to be prioritized. You know, budget is a big one. I would say another one is reorganizations. Sometimes an administration will come in and they will look at the org chart and, you know, they will see how they can make it 1,000 times better, and we will all reorganize and we will shift and things will change and we'll finally get comfortable, and then somebody else comes in and they want to reorganize it. And I'm not kidding, it has happened. We've gone back to the way we were before. So I would say those two are the most significant.
Thank you. It's helpful to understand that scope. Another question from a participant. How does your agency identify contamination on residential properties? It's a two-part. And do you have the resources to proactively test properties?
That's a good question. So how we define contamination is through nationally developed screening criteria. These are numbers for individual constituents that have been developed by typically toxicologists as it pertains to human health. We have other numbers that are ecologically based. And they are developed through studies, whether it's epidemiological studies or critter studies, if we're talking about those ecological numbers. They're developed in consultation with the overall peer-reviewed literature, and they are designed to be super conservative. So they are much lower than the actual risk or exposure outcome within those studies. And so these screening criteria are sort of our red flag. If we are conducting an investigation and we find ourselves, continuing to go into offsite properties because we go until it stops, and we're on a residential property, we use the screening criteria that are specific to that residential scenario. And those differ from like commercial or industrial scenarios because the formulation of those numbers assume certain highly conservative things, like you will be exposed to that piece of soil for 365 days a year. You will inhale or ingest, X amount of that contaminant, etc. So those are how they're developed specifically for residential scenarios. And does the agency proactively sample, residential properties? No, I would say no. The Superfund program, really doesn't even have the capacity to do such a thing. If it is within the context of an investigation and there is reason to believe that the contamination has migrated to that property, then samples will be conducted. But I would say that's really the most appropriate scope or the most common scope for that.
Interesting. Going back to the conversation around the responsible party, there's another question. If the responsible party is not capable of paying, for example, a small company, then who would pay for the remediation?
So if the company is not capable of paying, typically that kicks it into the Superfund arena. And so Superfund also deals with viable entities that are still around, but that for whatever reason can't do the investigation or can't pay for the cleanup. And in that case, sometimes taxpayer dollars are used, but typically that would then pull in Department of Justice, and there would be an effort made to recuperate as much of those taxpayer dollars as is possible. If it's like a rinky-dinky, facility, and they're willing to do the work, etc., I think it's possible that there's a scenario that we would just pace the investigation accordingly. Look at their cost estimates, look at their financials, and pace it accordingly. I think
she'll work with them. Yeah. Okay, so another question. Do you think community engagement beforehand would reduce some of the community backlash?
Oh gosh, proactive community engagement is so important. Now, obviously, you have to know that you're sort of in the neighborhood. So if I have a facility and there's the closest neighborhood is 3 miles away, then it is unlikely that the agency is going to spend a lot of resources doing any kind of proactive community engagement. But when you're right on top of a community, absolutely. Early and often, it's really important. In fact, I have a site right now that it's impacting the Midwest's very first national park. I bet you all can figure that out. So it's not a residential property, but it's our property. It's a national park. It's all of our property. And I have been working with important stakeholders, the environmental groups, and the National Park Service, for years, inviting them to meetings, taking them out to the site, and we are now poised to propose the final cleanup. And I think it has been really, really helpful. Folks have some context.
So this might be an interesting transition as you're talking about national parks. So many of them were shut down, obviously, during COVID and are now, I think, mainly back online. So the question is, how has COVID social distancing impacted your work with the public? Or has it perhaps?
Yeah, no, it has. It really has. When this first came down in March, the first thing I did was start making calls about the first case study that I talked about. I made sure that my work on that site was considered essential. If we needed to evacuate a homeowner, I did not want to be restricted from going there and helping that person. And so because of the imminent threats in that community, I was able to get deemed essential for that site. It did not come to fruition, which is great for them. But that, the other site that I'm referring to with respect to the national park, I am in the process of a public participation period right now. That is the formal process by which we collect public comments. And typically we have a public meeting, and I love public meetings. I mean, you get out in front of whoever shows up, and you have, it's such a nice connection. Sometimes it's not nice, but you know what I mean. It's a valuable connection, and I think the community really deserves that one-on-one time where they can look you in the eyes and say, hey, what are you going to do about this? We can't do that right now. And so we nationally, the EPA developed a way to deal with this, and that's just a pre-recorded presentation that we put up onto our website. I blanketed the community with fact sheets that were mailed, put out a press release, put it in the local newspaper, and then one evening about halfway through the public comment period, we'll have a live call-in Q&A for folks. So, it's not ideal for people not to be able to have an in-face public meeting, but I am still getting a lot of engagement right now, and, the information is getting out, which is the most important thing.
Well, I think giving people the platform to share their concerns or comments is always important. And I wonder if however many years from now, if it increases because people have a different schedule, if they are still working remotely and not keeping their pre-COVID schedules, whatever that looks like.
Yeah, sure.
What changes in our environment have you seen that gives you hope or excite you?
That gives me hope or excites me. This sounds so hokey, but it's really the people power. It's the fact that more people are more environmentally engaged, that they feel invested in what's going on around them. I mean, that gives me a lot of hope. There are a lot of things that, give me the opposite, but as far as hope is concerned, it's really the people power component of it.
It's definitely become more mainstream in our culture, where people are talking in a very general sense about the environment and what that means. And
yeah, absolutely. And all of these NGOs and groups that, there's a huge coalition now involved in responding to the public participation period I'm doing right now. And it's got everyone from, Earth Justice to the NAACP. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's awesome. So I get to interact with all of those environmental groups, and they know what's up. Like they are incredibly informed.
Yeah, and I always think, again, going back to the public platform that you provide for people to share their thoughts and comments, even if people are complaining, they're sharing their passion. So it's great that they are engaging. And to your point, I don't think it's hokey at all. I think it's great that people are really digging in and understanding the impact.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
So I think I probably have time for one more question, and I actually have two that I'm going to combine, if you will, because I think that they might have a nice synergy. So if you'll allow me. So the first question is, what experiences, courses, or jobs while you were at UIC helped you prepare for your work And then the second question, which I'm going to combine, is how did you first become interested in environmental work for a career? So I don't know if there was a synergy for your time at UIC or not, but I think that they lead together.
No, I popped out of the womb wanting to do this work. I can't explain it, but when the Exxon Valdez spill occurred, I was fixated. I had my oceans book and I was studying the spill constantly. It has always been the direction I wanted to go in, and so there was never any question. And I had the opportunity to interview with EPA in 2003. And I really just thought it was interview practice. I thought I was going to go on and get more degrees. I did it right out of the gates at UIC. I worked a short period of time with the Illinois Public Interest Research Group. That somewhat helped me prepare, and certainly I would say my ecology courses at UIC were incredibly instrumental from the perspective of learning how to science, learning how to think. And my job at UIC, I worked in the molecular genetics lab, and same thing. It taught me how to science, taught me how to think, and it also gave me insight into the world of people that are immersed and totally passionate about what they do. I was surrounded by cancer researchers. Those people are, pretty intense. And so those experiences, they really shaped my desire to just be in it 100%. That's the only job that I want.
Oh, that's wonderful. And we can feel your passion through the screen, because the point about being in person is not the same as being in the same room. But Michelle, we certainly are very proud that you are a UIC graduate, and thank you for sharing all of your knowledge with us today and for having this conversation. I learned a ton of things, and are so glad that you are in the position that you are in. So thank you again for spending time with us today.
Absolutely, happy to do so.
Well, great. We may ask you to come back again as the world continues to evolve. So just real quick, next week, please join us on Wednesday, July 22nd at 6 p.m. Central Time for our next Alumni Exchange event, which will be featuring UIC alumnus Dr. Benjamin Ritter, who will present an interactive discussion on finding your career sweet spot. You can find more information at go.uic.edu/alumni exchange. And of course, please be on the lookout for that quick survey. I promise it will take just a few seconds. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you again, Michelle. It's really been a pleasure. And clearly you have found your career sweet spot, so that's wonderful. We really appreciate all your time and all of you for joining us today. Have a great rest of your afternoon, and we look forward to seeing all of you again in the Alumni Exchange. Have a great day.